at IRES and in the School of Community and Regional Planning. As we begin, I'd like to just take a minute to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and to express our collective gratitude for the opportunity to work and to learn on these lands. So I have the pleasure of introducing the first of the two speakers today, and that's Alexa Tanner, who's a PhD student working with me. Alexa's interest is in how people perceive risks and make risk management decisions associated with natural hazards. This is an area that she's had a long-standing interest in, I would say, and it dates back to her undergraduate work, which was on understanding undergraduate students' emergency preparedness at the University of Waterloo, which is particularly impressive in that she was able to publish it, which I think is quite rare. So that was her undergraduate work. In her master's research, she continued to work on risk perception and emergency preparedness, looking at the 2013 Calgary floods, the major floods in 2013. And since coming to UBC, she's continued to do work in that area in sort of many different strands, one of which is not technically part of her thesis, but is still really interesting, is some collaborative work that she did on tsunami warnings, not even a tsunami event, but just the tsunami warning and how that affected people's risk perceptions in Port Alberni in BC. In Alexa's dissertation research, she's focusing on the theme of multi-hazard risks. And I just want to point out that, at least this is my take on this, is that multi-hazard risks is an emerging area that's really an important reality check from my perspective on the risk perception literature, because researchers tend to really study hazards in isolation, one hazard at a time. I do research on earthquakes, I do research on floods, the study is about tsunamis. And in reality, people don't live in a single hazard context, and they don't, perceive and behave and make decisions in a single hazard context. It's really in the context of all the different kinds of risks that they face. And Alexa's work is making some innovative inroads into this area of multi-hazard risks. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexa. And I just want to, before I do that, apologize in advance to both Alexa and Jack that I won't be able to stay since I have to go teach my class, but I'm sure these will be really interesting presentations. So over to you, Alexa.
All right, thank you. And I will play my presentation. You guys can see the screen without the notes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you. So thanks, Stephanie. I have the acknowledgements at the end, but I would like to take my quick second to acknowledge Stephanie in the lab right now. I've learned so much over the past, 5 years, and I'm excited to share this work, and I'm excited to show what I've learned from the lab. So today's presentation is on multi-hazard risk, as Stephanie introduced nicely, and I'm particularly looking at understanding the contextual factors behind looking at risk perceptions from a natural hazard perspective. And to put this in perspective, I'm just going to walk through an example that many of us who've lived in Vancouver during the past summer have experienced. So if we can think back to, I believe it was July, we had the extreme heat event. That heat event was, I think it's turned out to be one of BC's deadliest disasters. I think it was also some of Canada's hottest temperatures. So as this was happening, and it was still in July, the higher elevations were having rapid snowmelt from the seasonal snowpack we had, which led to flooding in some of the lower lying regions in the foothills of those mountains. So communities were evacuating during this extreme heat because of flooding. And then there were the other communities that were evacuating because of wildfires. Of course, extreme heat comes with drought, comes with very dry surface temperature, soil, which triggered some wildfires. And these wildfires lasted not just into July, but also into August and a bit into September. So as you can see, an emergency manager might be kind of piling up what they have to deal with, what kind of risks they're looking at. And then there's also the ripple and longer term events of like the CN rail network disruption. I just read a report today actually how the CN rail network wasn't what caused the fire, but there was concerns at one point that was a risk. There's also the risk of maybe it will in the future as conditions change. What does the rail system do? And also, if you look into California, which might be a couple years ahead of us in terms of the wildfire risk, the concern about power lines during high wind and dry events. So you can see that natural hazards have societal consequences. And of course, I should add, when there's no power or when the rail network gets disrupted, that's the supply chain. And that is what keeps kind of society up and running. So the ripple events are huge. As well, at the same time, and that these events were happening, there's also the opioid crisis, which is putting a lot of stress on emergency response systems like the EMS, as well, of course, COVID. I think this goes without saying. The stress COVID has put on everyone, particularly those working in the healthcare system and emergency management. There's not much extra capacity. And this was occurring at the same time that the residential schools, the discoveries were being made, and there's a lot of trauma being brought up from that. And a lot of these communities are smaller communities. Some of them are Indigenous communities. So the amount of stress that was already placed on a system. And I'm just providing this as an example of a multi-hazard kind of time period we've lived through if we've lived in Vancouver during the summer. This is kind of the real world, what we've experienced. But there's also the academic literature. So what does the academic literature say? Well, there's a couple types of multi-hazard events that we can live through or that are the present. So the first is changing conditions. Changing conditions are when one event, for example, a wildfire, leads to subsequent hazards. So the wildfire comes through, it might damage some of the siding of a hill, and that leads to more landslides and flooding. And if flooding occurs, there might be more sediment, which leads to worse conditions. So that's how one event changes the conditions for future events. Next is cascading hazards, and this is when one event can lead to subsequent and maybe unpredicted events. So CI failure would be critical infrastructure system failure. So an earthquake may lead to, for example, the power lines not working, the water system being down, sewage system being down. And of course, you could imagine the ripple effects of that, leading into like education, hospitals, being able to drink clean water. So there's a lot of feedback loops and cascading events that are very difficult to predict. As well, compounding hazards. And this is when there's one event, in my example here, the hurricane, which has a lot of subsequent and different hazards underneath it. So the hurricane comes, high winds, a lot of rain, potential for tornadoes, sea level rise, or storm surge, there you go, which leads to the concurrent hazards that need to be responded to. And then the last one is independent hazards. And these are when two separate events are occurring by coincidence at the same time. So heat and COVID. And as the academic literature says, well, we are able to study each of these hazards individually. It's when you look at the big picture that it's much harder to predict, and the events that occur are not the sum of the individuals added up. So doing a model on flooding won't necessarily lead to what the disaster, the outcome is if flooding also led to a critical infrastructure system failure. So that's what the academic literature says. And then what do the people who work in emergency management do, and what do they think? So this is getting into some of the interviews that I'll talk about in a couple slides. But first is the consequence management. A lot of times emergency managers come in to help with a problem. So if there's a fire, help house people, make sure they have enough like clothes, toothbrushes, like that type of stuff. They're dealing with the consequences. And as different hazards occur, then there's more and more consequences to manage. And then they also talk about taking an all hazards approach. And I put all hazards in brackets here because it tends, and I'll talk about this as well in a couple slides, it tends to focus on one hazard, despite the legislation saying that the plans that communities have should cover all the hazards. So they should be generic and flexible enough to cover all the hazards. So that's what practice says, that's what academic literature says, and this is what the practitioners say, and that leads to what my dissertation's about. And I have three portions to my dissertation. The first, looking at the effects of multiple hazard experience and examining to see if you've had experience with 1, 2, or 3 hazards, how that affects your perceptions of risk of a different hazard that you may not necessarily have experienced. The second study, and that's what I'm presenting today, is looking at emergency managers, how they're managing multi-hazard risk, how they think about it. And then the last study is looking at community differences. So how do, for example, urban or rural communities, how does that change the exposure to risk, but also how they perceive risk? Of course, this is backed up by the academic literature. This is more the fine details of what you may see a paper on. So for example, how responsibility or trust in taking action, how that affects behaviors, how that affects actions. And then this is all supported by the broader picture of natural hazards and risk perception literature, which is my background. And the sum of this is what I hope to contribute, which is strengthening our understandings of perceptions towards multiple hazards. And today I'm just presenting on one portion of this, and that is managing risks in multi-hazard settings within BC. And I picked this particular study because of the context, because of the work we're all kind of doing, and that BC is local and close. So what did I do? I interviewed 29 individuals who work in emergency management or risk management between July and September 2020. So last year, this was during COVID. It was kind of a bit of a lull before we picked up into the fall wave. So COVID was definitely very much front of mind, but they were also kind of looking around to see what's coming to get things under control for the wildfire and the flood season, and heat and air quality were also concerned. So when I started these interviews, I always opened with COVID, getting people to talk about their experience because it was forefront of their mind, but not necessarily the central focus of my work, and then transitioned to talking about how multi-hazard risk comes up in their work. I did an open-ended structure or open-ended interview process to allow people to elaborate on a range of views, and I didn't want to direct them in any one direction because I was just trying to get a general sense of the themes that were happening within their work. And to fit into a work kind of schedule, they're typically 50 minutes with 10 minutes 10 minutes to get the background information and wrap things up. Once this was done, I conducted a thematic analysis to pull out key themes, and that's what I'm presenting today, supported by some quotes that I think exemplify what I'm talking about. So the three key themes that I've found were first, the kind of dominance of a single hazard perspective. So that raises questions about how different hazards are viewed. Then looking at how the multi-hazard perspective does show up in their work. And then that kind of leads nicely into adapting to new risks. What are the steps going forward? And it leads nicely because COVID, I believe, is some of the first time people were really thinking that multiple hazards are a concern. And of course, climate change is an ongoing threat. So the first theme, single hazard perspective. What I found was that every hazard was being managed by a different group of people. Even though emergency managers were kind of the central, they're there to help set the background conditions to allow for response. But the individual actions were done by different people. So as I'll show in the next couple slides with quotes, Wildfire has fire smart fire services, which allows the community to have extra capacity. This is in contrast with flooding, which is meant to be a local, or is meant to be a regional approach, but it ends up being local, and there's just small grants that come available. And then pandemic, as kind of to compare this to, is meant to be a health perspective. However, as was seen, a lot of the work was shifted to emergency management as well. And there's also differing degrees of frequency. So pandemic is very rare, except for the current time. We haven't had too many of them. This is in contrast to wildfire, where it's a seasonal occurrence every year. People know it's coming, they know to prepare, they know to take specific actions. And this is contrasted again to earthquakes, where we've had fairly limited experience with that in the area, which means that it's harder to motivate action. And then an alternative approach and a way to look at this is from that all hazards perspective. And this would be doing things like evacuation planning or providing emergency social support or services which fall under all the different hazards or many of the different hazards. And they could be wide stretching. However, as we'll see, there may be room for improvement there. So as a quote for the wildfire, the actions that communities can take are very specific, they're relatively low cost, and people can see that they're making a difference. So the quote goes, if we get our wildfire mitigation specialists to come in and do assessments on the homes, at the end of the day, science proves that this method, this Home Partners program, will actually reduce the loss of structure during a wildfire event. And quite importantly, this work also has provincial funding associated with it so that there can be a coordinator to do it. So as we'll see with other hazards, it's clear that work needs to be done. However, there's no financial capacity for someone to come in and actually do that work. So this quote just represents that FireSmart is working well for these communities, despite seeing some pretty bad wildfires last year. But it does provide capacity and it does provide specific actions. This is in contrast to earthquakes, which have limited local action that can be done. It's typically at the provincial level. However, it's kind of hard to motivate specific people or specific communities to take any action. So this quote goes, the ever-present earthquake event for which there is really not a specific upper-level government funding for. We know that certainly there is attention to it and there is seriousness about it. The province is invested in earthquake exercises like the one in Port Alberni years ago. However, we don't have any of the expertise and resources to do that much more than participate in the events that the province puts on and follow building codes. So this kind of shows the limited nature of what communities can actually do to overcome earthquakes or earthquake damages, and the room for improvement and possibly lessons learned from what the wildfire is doing. That leads to the multi-hazard perspective. So how do you manage the different hazards? And as I've talked about already, there is the all hazards approach. This is in BC legislation. They're currently modernizing it to align with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which looks at a community-wide perspective of actions you can take to reduce damage overall. However, currently that is kind of on the side and they're working on having a hazard risk vulnerability analysis complete for each community. These analyses rank the risks that the community face and then also look at what can be done. But as we'll see in these quotes, it's focused on one, they tend to be focused on one hazards. So it's meant to be all hazards as the legislation states. However, one hazard is used as the anchor to compare to other hazards. And as I quote, I would say we do a lot of planning. I mean, it's all hazards planning, but I would say at the very forefront of our minds, it's flood hazard. And the next quote shows again that this is in the case of wildfire, that in a quote, we just completed an evacuation plan. We were really only thinking about wildfires. It's hard to imagine another hazard that will trigger an evacuation. So in that case, it did end up being very hazard specific planning. And I think that if we sat here and thought about what could require an evacuation, we could think of more than just wildfire. And that leads to a limited plan when you've put a lot of effort into this evacuation planning when it's missing a lot of other components that could be relatively included. That said, there's also the recognition that multi-hazards are a concern. And this is a quote by a watershed protections officer, and I won't read the whole block of text, but what it's saying is that there is recognition that when one hazard has a bad year, the other hazards may as well. So in this quote, they're talking about how a bad flood season leads to a bad wildfire season and people become exhausted, potentially injured, resources are already at times used up for flooding, and there's not necessarily the capacity to then switch to wildfire because there's some equipment and personnel that are the same that do work both. And this is concerning as the multi-hazard events become more frequent. And I will switch now to the looking at what the future holds. And COVID was really the turning point for that and turning point for thinking about multi-hazard risks because of the hazard vulnerability analysis that communities have to do and the planning that goes behind that. There's a lot of assumptions that the reports or the plans there, if something happens, we go to the binder, open it up and see what the steps are and follow the steps. However, with COVID, they opened those binders and there was not much practical information in them. A lot of it was phone the health sector. The health sector is responsible. At the same time, the city they're working for, the region they're working for, was telling them, no, this is your responsibility, take action. What cleaning supplies do we need? Where are stockpiles? And they didn't exist. So I think COVID was a recognition of the limited nature of that plan. Additionally, a lot of the plans, particularly for earthquakes, include notes saying external support will come in. External support from either Canada or the US or a more global audience. However, with COVID, it was a global stress on the system. And there, as we saw, everyone was struggling. So there was no external support. And then finally, it's another unprecedented event. These unprecedented events are, I don't know, that they seem to be more precedented than a normal event. So the recognition that hazards are changing, which goes to how is adaptation going? And people or the risk and emergency managers are seeing that the risks are changing. So wildfire has been seen as an emerging hazard. There's more awareness of it. Risk profiles are changing, and this needs to be adapted into communities' plans. There we go. And then the modeling that's done for things like wildfire have seen a huge increase. So not just in the severity, but the frequency. As that second quote shows, wildfire events are increasing by approximately, or the models are saying approximately 300%, which means, again, more stress on the people working in them, more time, as the quote says, more time away from family, more stress on the individual, but also more stress on the system as a whole. And when I talked to the provincial government representatives about this, they recognize the risks are changing, that there needs to be wide-scale action, which is in part why that Sendai framework is coming in. However, change takes a long time and mitigation is expensive, and there's not a whole lot of resources to go around, but a lot of change that needs to happen. So the recognition of the challenges in place and the reality of the system that we are working within. Also, the recognition that decisions we're making now affects what the future holds and what state we're going to be in for the future of society. So the way forward, this presentation started with the single hazard characteristics before looking at the multi-hazard aspect and the interconnected systems before switching to the changing systems. So I found that each hazard is perceived differently with different actors involved. They're intricately intertwined with both physical and social systems, and that building resilience misses some of the critical interdependencies that lead to needing more integration between multi-hazard systems and associated guidance on action. So as I will mention again, Sendai framework says the need for a multi-hazard approach, but beyond that, it's kind of left up to everyone else to understand what that actually means. So some key takeaways: the multi-hazard risks need to be prioritized in full recognition of the contexts that they're occurring in. Each hazard is viewed differently and has different people involved, and this affects mitigation and who's responsible, and then the gap between academics and practitioners. And this is how I started the presentation. So academics have one perspective, practitioners have another, and there's just a gap in how we're acting. Finally, so shifting away from an all hazards or one hazards approach, recognition that emergencies are the outcome of the current system. So we should be taking action now to help ourselves in the future, and that there's a lot of really great people within the communities, within the government system, and we need to build on those strengths rather than getting stuck in bureaucratic difficulties. All right, so acknowledgements. I already acknowledged Stephanie, but I'll acknowledge her again. Thank you very much for all the work and all the lab members I've worked with over the years, as well as the people I interviewed. They're wonderful to listen to and to analyze their thoughts, as well as the funding for this work, which is UBC Public Scholars and SHIRK. So thank you, and I will pass this to Gunilla.
Thank you. Great presentation. Very interesting work indeed. Big applause to see it among everybody who are here. So we have time for a few questions. See if someone raises their hands. Any questions for Alexa? Don't be shy, students first. Anna, we have difficulties hearing you. Do you think you can? Yeah. Maybe someone in between as Anna is getting her stuff ready. I'm curious to see, it's a very interesting job. I mean, all of us were suffering through the heat and the fires and all that happening. What would your advice be to the practitioners? I mean, that we know that there is a big gap between academics and practitioners, but where would you, if you had all the money you wanted to go and do something, what would your intervention be based on your research?
I would get more people involved in, so it seemed like the emergency managers were tasked with like anything that anyone didn't want to work with. And so their job description became huge. And there's also only, most communities have 1 or 2 people. So I would recommend getting more people involved in the mitigation, the longer term perspective. Big cities like Vancouver do wonderful. They do have whole departments for that. They do have whole climate change adaptation groups who touch on things like air quality, touch on things like heat, where it's a smaller communities, it's left to 1 or 2 people. So that's from the local practitioner level, which of course is directed by provincial and federal directives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anna, do you have your microphone now?
Yes, I guess so.
Someone has to turn off their microphone. Technical complications. We'll type the question instead in the chat. So here's the question coming in the chat.
I can follow up if we want to just switch to Jack, so we have enough time to his presentation.
Okay, so let's do that. We'll take question to Alexa later. So
yeah.
Thank you again for a great presentation.
Thank you.
So we're moving over to Jack Durant, who is a master's student, and he's right now in the UK. I was hoping that he would be staying here. I mean, he plays the drums and he loves scuba diving and ski instructor, so we all thought he would stay here, but that didn't happen. Jack has a undergrad from Cambridge in philosophy, and he came here to study with me and Daniel Steele, who I believe also is here. And he's been working with questions about chemicals and chemicals management, which has been interesting to hear how a philosopher attacks that problem. And it's about different perceptions of what the risk actually is and how to handle it. And he has explored a new method or used it in a quite different way. And I will leave it to him to describe how he used broker dialogues and what he did with that method, because I find it very interesting and exciting, and also the results. And I know that the 2 people who he has interviewed are really curious to hear about the outcome as well.
Great, thanks so much, Gunilla. Let me just get my screen share. Okay, can people see what's going on? Okay, great. Hello, I'm Jack, and I'm currently finishing my MA here at IRES with Gunilla Oberg, Anna Heike Leopold, and Daniel Steele as part of the Agesta lab. So the title of my thesis is Divergent Understandings of Uncertainty in the Endocrine Disruptor Expert Deliberation. My talk today comes in 3 parts. First, background, which will focus on endocrine disruptors, the controversy surrounding them, and some framing decisions I made going into the study. Then the study, which will cover the study's aims and methods. And then finally, the analysis, which will cover my analytic approach, the results, and then leave some time for discussion as well. So the background. An endocrine disruptor, hence ED, is any substance that interferes with or otherwise adversely affects, give me one moment, or otherwise adversely affects hormonal systems in animals and humans. They work by either mimicking the body's natural hormones, interfering with hormone production, disrupting how a hormone is broken down and stored in our bodies, or by changing our body's sensitivity to other hormones. In humans, these effects have been linked to the development of a host of issues, including obesity. Sorry about the phone call. Maybe I'll just power on, including obesity, infertility, cancer, and learning difficulties. And though less is known, similar effects have been observed in ED-exposed wildlife too. So EDs are everywhere. They're in our food, they're in our clothes, they're on receipts, they're in tap water. We come into contact with at least 800 different EDs in an average day. So living a modern life untouched by them is an impossibility at this point. Their ubiquity alone demands attention, but to complicate matters further, early research suggests some EDs pose distinctive harms. These include epigenetic harms, where an ED-exposed organism's offspring may suffer adverse effects as a result of a previous generation's exposure, and non-monotonic dose-response dynamics, which concerns the idea of a non-linear relation between the degree of exposure and the harms produced, thus introducing the possibility of serious health consequences from very low exposures. So some examples of these squiggly dose-response dynamics can be seen in the graph at the bottom of this picture web here. Yeah. There's very little settled research in this field. Only a handful of chemicals have something approaching a consensus in terms of the harm they can be reliably linked with. BPA and DDT are two that you may have heard of. Further, the tone of the expert discussion can be combative, well exemplified in the accusations of some scientists secretly working for Greenpeace or chemicals companies like 3M, which is found in the field presently. And emerging literature, of which the Agesta Lab is a part of, is finding evidence these experts often begin their work from different and somewhat contradictory starting points. For example, some papers work from the assumption that there are rigid, well-supported weight of evidence protocols in the ED research context, while others deny that such a thing is possible on current understandings. So a consequence of these divergent framings and conclusions is that the knowledge being produced is sometimes conflicting. And relating to this divergence, the understood degree and nature of the uncertainty appears to differ in the literature as well. And this is where I hope my study can be of some use. So before giving some further study context, here's the definition of uncertainty that I approached my study with. Any deviation from the unachievable ideal of a completely deterministic knowledge of the relevant system, as taken from Walker et al. I settled on this definition as it allows for the broadest possible gamut of factors that might contribute to uncertainty. So casting the net wide like this was kind of a tactical ploy to avoid prematurely excluding any potentially interesting and uncertainty pertinent results. So a key problem framing move I've made is understanding some of these expert groups as functioning like epistemic cultures. So the epistemic cultures concept was advanced by Norsatina in response to her ethnographic field work on practicing scientists. The idea was, in particular expert context, different epistemic machinery would develop thanks to a mix of necessity, affinity, and historical coincidence. And this machinery would involve things like a lab's social organization, its approach to experimentation, its patterns of reasoning, and its weighting of evidence. These machineries are then responsible for generating the given epistemic culture's capital U understanding, which includes not just the knowledge generated, but other knowledge-related phenomena like negative knowledge, what we know we don't know, and non-knowledge, what we don't know, thus shaping the understood degree and form of uncertainty in a given science context. So I've chosen to understand the group through this lens because I believe the literature and state of science lends itself quite naturally to this analysis, but also because it encourages a more anthropological look at the discussion, which I believe is going to be key to negotiating the current impasse. So given our lab and others' research suggesting more science is unlikely to solve the disagreements in this field, thanks to the values and framings at play, approaching the discussion in anthropological terms seems set to yield helpful insight where a more technical analysis might falter. So I hope. So what now? Combining these thoughts, it seems as though there are three tasks to focus on. to focus on in the interest of advancing the ED discussion. We need to shed light on how the relevant epistemic cultures understand uncertainty in the ED research context. We need to better understand in what ways these understandings differ and in what ways they're similar. And more broadly, we need to encourage group dialogue or intergroup dialogue in the field. So it looks like we need a set of ethnographic, dialogic, semi-structured interviews focused on the understandings of uncertainty, which is convenient because that is what my study is going to be doing. So there are two broad study aims here, following from the needs just discussed. One is just hoping to shed some light on the uncertainty understandings in the field, and the other is hoping to encourage productive dialogue across these epistemic cultures. So as I get into my methodology, hopefully you'll see how I hope to do that. So focusing on the methodology now, brokered dialogue is a qualitative research method developed in 2012 by Parsons and Lavery at the University of Toronto. It takes its inspiration from visual anthropology and aims to shed light on scientific controversies through encouraging a structured dialogue between experts from opposing sides of the discussion. The methodology involves a filmed interview with an expert from one side, where they're given space to express their thoughts and feelings on the debate. The footage is then edited in collaboration with the participant and shown to a member of the opposing side for comment, whose thoughts are then in turn recorded and presented back to the original participant. And then the process continues as long as is judged necessary in a given research context. So a quick thanks to Bronwyn here, because it was her that put me onto this methodology, and hopefully it's yielded some pretty interesting results. So an advantage of this is that it allows for extensive and less guarded responses than if the participants were face-to-face, with the brokered nature also ensuring that the conversation stays measured and on topic, and the dialogical component in turn shedding light not just on the participant views individually, but how the sides of the conflict interact, which is obviously a vital detail when you're trying to get a sense of the science on the whole. So the methodology I ended up using for my study was a slightly modified version of this. The key modifications are that in my methodology, there are two conversation streams, here represented in grey and orange. And this was to ensure that both participants got a chance to set the terms of a conversation by airing their thoughts at the outset, so avoiding the threat of one participant having an outside influence on the discussion topics. A further modification comes in the use of prompts, and these prompts were open-ended and designed to encourage free associative answers, but they also served as an aid to keep the conversation on topic where possible. So participant selection was perhaps the most challenging part of this whole study. It took 6 months to find 2 participants, which was a pretty character-building odyssey. A further challenge came from the second part of the criteria here, so these cultures are really cleanly separated, as you might guess, and it's difficult to gauge what a given scientist's epistemic machineries are before talking to them about it directly. But thanks to the help of one of my supervisors, Anna Heike, who has a good grasp of the researchers in the field, and some research-focused investigative work, we found 2 willing scientists who seem likely to be working within different epistemic cultures. An example indicator here being one scientist was very alert to the threat of the low-dose ED responses that I mentioned earlier, while the other was more dismissive of them based on current evidence. So here's the study in numbers. Definitely not as impressive as Alexa's, but there was 2 scientists, 6 interviews, 5.5 hours total interview data, 15 prompts, and then 50 minutes of clips exchanged, and could also add the 6 months of delicate rejections in there as well. So onto the analysis. Drawing from Parsons and Lavery again, their original analytic approach, my data analysis process was orientated around getting to the core narrative takeaway that the participant was advancing. So getting there involved a 3-step process, beginning with thematically coding the individual interviews and then coding their interactions, and then inductively generating a story structure code to present what I understood as their single take-home message. So all analysis basically leading up to generating this single story. So here's a visualization of the study. The 2 circles at the bottom represent the total set of data gathered from the participants in their respective interviews. The arrows between them represent the interactive data, so the parts where they responded directly to one another. And then the 2 ends emerging out of the interview data set represent the emerging narrative advanced by the participants. And the MN circle in the middle there represents the meta-narrative, which is what broader story can we draw from these 2 take-home narratives, how they're different, how they're similar, what lessons can we learn from it, and what future research directions can we draw from it. Going to zoom through the analysis process now, beginning with the preliminary thematic analysis of the interview. So these grey boxes highlighting what we're going to be looking at now. So I used a very simple code structure here, inspired by Walker et al. Again, based on the idea that uncertainty claims tend to have 3 dimensions associated with them. First, we have the locus, which is where in the broader system is this uncertainty being generated. Then we have the type, which is what type of uncertainty is being represented. This is a little less intuitive, so I'll get into that a bit on the next slide. And finally, we have severity, which is what degree of uncertainty is being presented. For this, I used a 5-part ordinal scale ranging from minor to critical. This was judged from language use, tone, emphasis, body language, and conversational context. Not an exact science, but the thought being that this could provide interesting comparative data when developing that final narrative analysis. So, oh wait, yeah. So this is the typology, uncertainty typology I just mentioned. The literature regarding how best to divide types of uncertainty is distinctly unsettled at the moment. And of the myriad options that are out there, I went for the SEMPT one, inspired by the work of van der Sloos et al., and also the one that Bronwyn used in her research last year, if people remember that. I picked it mainly because it's built up a degree of use momentum in recent years, and also because it was quite a natural fit for the data my study produced. So as you can see, there's 4 uncertainty types: societal, epistemic, methodological, and technical. Examples under these terms range from things, societal things like what's in fashion funding-wise in academics at a given period, and then to technical things like students getting decimal places wrong when they're recording data. Breaking the uncertainty into types like this was important in gauging what sort of form the participants understood the uncertainty in their field as taking on the whole. And as I shall soon reveal, they leaned in very different directions on this typology. So getting into some coding examples, here is a quote from the interview. Here's a quote from one of the interviews in response to a general prompt about what we can do to reduce uncertainty in the ED research field. So, fundamental research on invertebrate species, lower trophic organisms. Enough with the fish, okay? If you want to revisit fish, improve your models. 3 species with the same reproductive strategy. When you have 35,000 species, you can choose whatever you like. It's a crime, it's convenience, it's not science. So here's that same quote, but with a coding demonstration below. So the locus being in academic laboratories, the type being methodological, as the cited issue involves inappropriate methods. I chose a methodological type as the example here, as this was the uncertainty type that scientist 1 ended up focusing on the most, which again, I'll get back to. And then lastly, the severity being significant. That comes across in the strength of language and by dint of its importance being re-emphasized elsewhere in the interviews. So here's another example. This is in response to a prompt about what specific factors affect reliability of science in the ED context. So, well, obviously, if it's funded by industry, it's not going to be trusted. Well, not by me, 0, 0. And it can be like a friend of mine who conducts the research. I will not trust it. So pretty strongly worded in that instance. I chose the societal type example here, as this ended up being the key type for scientist 2. So note that there's a different emphasis in type compared to scientist 1. And then also, obviously the severity here is critical, as you can probably gauge just from the intensity of the language. So next is the interactive analysis. Again, really simple coding approach here: agree and then disagree either by emphasis or disagree via inconsistent positions. And then this was measured in a similar ordinal scale where I judged the degree of agreement or disagreement occurring. So this is a first exchange example. I would break those stupid silos as if human is not an animal. This is freaking me out. The proof of this is that now zebrafish is used as a human model, and the response is the endocrine system has evolved in different ways. And this is exactly what's fascinating for a comparative endocrinologist and toxicologist. When you apply these chemicals, not only how to pin the differences in the things we share, but the things that we don't share, because they're important. Well, you know, it's just like glass half full or half empty. It's the response. So this is an interesting one because it's disagreement via emphasis, which is kind of addressed explicitly by scientist 1 in the final response. And again, just the rough judgment that this is a significant disagreement. Okay, so yeah, on to the final narrative analysis now. So drawing from everything we've looked at so far. The final step in this analysis involved inductively generating a story structure code to present the key emerging narrative. This code forms the fun but not strictly relevant acronym of SPACE, which stands for setting, where is this happening, plot, what's happening, actors slash actants, so who or what is responsible or active in this uncertainty generation. Conclusion, what's the potential resolution here? And evaluation, how do they feel about all of this? The choice to focus on one particular narrative thread, I should mention, was quite an easy one in the end, because each scientist did have a standout point that they kept returning to throughout the interviews, so it lended itself to this analysis quite neatly. So all my rambling has been leading up to this, the core uncertainty stories. This is scientist one's core uncertainty story, the tale of the misfiring academic system. So the setting is in academic research institutions, and the plot is the university system misincentivizes researchers and rewards sloppy and sensationalist work. Convenience and careerism is chosen over necessary and straightforward methodological and technical improvements. Science like this is boring, but it's the curse we bear. We're still very uncertain in EDU research, and the academic system is largely why. So the actors and actants here are academics, the broader university system, money, publicity, status. And the conclusion is that though some components of the system are just facts of life, we can and should still strive to improve the methodology and technique. And this is the most critical avenue for addressing uncertainty. The evaluation being broad frustration, but hopeful in terms of encouraging technical improvements, and fatalist in terms of dealing with the base structural issues in academia long term. And here is the core uncertainty story of scientist 2. So the tale of the corrupting industry, setting chemical industrial complex, plot. Academics itself works well, but there's lots of purposefully misleading research advanced by industry interest that muddies the waters. Our methods and techniques are generally good, and we know a lot, but undue doubt is cast by those with vested interests. So the actors and actants here are industry, money, lobbyists, and poor regulation. And the conclusion is we need to restrict industry influence and prevent them from getting involved in research, or at least better vet their work. This is the most critical avenue for addressing uncertainty in the field. Evaluation, anger, disheartened, but hopeful in terms of tackling the industry, less interested in technical and methodological improvements, and just broad annoyance at the slow pace of improvement generally. So some study reflections. Firstly, I felt that there was a really interesting discrepancy between the participants' very nuanced and impressive understandings of what was generating the uncertainty in their field, and then the fact that they both actively noted that this sort of discussion was broadly novel to them. Secondly, more specific to the study aims, they both touched on similar themes and agreed in lots of areas, but the emphasis was on very different types of uncertainty, and the core uncertainty message, as just touched on, was very different and nearly the exact opposite in parts. So with this in mind, I think the most important takeaway from this study for people working in other fields is just how differently scientists in different groups can conceive of what the core issues facing their field are, and of course, how important communicating and discussing these concerns are for field advancement more generally. So this is a bit more rogue. I would definitely love some feedback on this, but a potential bonus finding is science studies as a conversation with alcohol. So basically, as you can see with these quotes, this image of this being a conversation that you should have in private and with a drink came up 4 times, and a few other times in unofficial conversations with scientists elsewhere. Given this fairly specific image and the amount and the fact that it cropped up unprompted 4 times, I felt it warranted potentially some direct analysis. So drawing from some classical psychoanalytic interpretation, which I know is a dangerous move, I've been thinking about what kind of associations they might have with this image, and so what the participants might be communicating through its repeated use. And this exercise has produced 3 possible implications as I've understood it so far. Firstly, that these conversations are interesting, but ultimately frivolous, and their inherent unseriousness keeps them in a casual social realm outside of the professional sphere, which is obviously intriguing if they do think that, so obviously highly speculative, as I will say several more times. Secondly, the image might imply a perceived distance between themselves and these problems altogether, suggesting that they could be serious in some sense, but are ultimately outside of their remit, and so to be discussed in a relaxed, amateurish manner, rather than with any direct responsibility. And lastly, I wondered whether the intimate audience more common in a social setting, as well as the fact that it would be off camera and sort of off record, suggested that these discussions are somewhat taboo potentially, and that their status as maybe the elephant in the room or being otherwise shun-worthy might involve a need to discuss something in private in a setting loosened with alcohol or something, which, if true, big if, would be an interesting finding as well. So as I mentioned, highly speculative. I'd be interested to hear if anyone thinks that this is worth pursuing or including in the thesis, but I thought I'd chuck it in here. Almost done. So I take that to be two broad future research directions that might be fruitful in response to this research. Firstly, continuing down the path this study took some early steps down and attempting to more formally map how these different cultures are understanding uncertainty. Georgia in our lab is currently working on a more conclusive mode of categorizing these cultures, which would be hugely useful to this research end. And secondly, relating to the primary findings of this research, it was clear both experts saw a huge amount of the field's uncertainty stemming from the academic ladder in the case of scientist one, and the influence of industry in the case of scientist two. So further investigations there could be fruitful also. Yes, I think that's everything. Thanks so much to my supervisors and lab mates, and of course the participants who gave me an insane amount of their time. And yeah, if you have any questions that you don't get to ask here, please email me. I think that's everything.
Thanks a lot, Jack. Wonderful. Great presentation. I have questions. We have applause from everybody. We'll take questions to Jack first, and then we'll jump over to the questions for Alexia. I see Brianne is holding up her hand, so please.
Hi, Jack. Great to see where your research has gone. I was curious, with your broken dialogue methodology, do you think that these different understandings of uncertainty first should be reconciled? And then two, do you think your method has a role in that?
Yeah, amazing question. So I think as it was originally conceived as a methodology, definitely it was made to have a role. I think a huge part of its original conception was that this is a space to shed some light on a discussion, but maybe even more important than that, actually like encourage discussion and allow them to kind of find a middle ground or better understand each other's positions in relation to uncertainty in this instance. The reason why I didn't lean into that too heavily in my research was partly because I don't think I had enough time for them to really get to know each other and kind of reach a middle ground. And also just because I noticed that they weren't really reaching a middle ground, which I guess is kind of interesting finding in itself. So I focused more on what I was learning about their positions rather than them kind of communicating and like changing their mind, because I just didn't notice that happening personally.
Thank you. Stephen.
Hi.
Aisha.
Aisha. I was watching the presentations with Steve. I mean, Jack, I thought the part about the bottles of wine was very interesting. For whole area for future work, but I am biased towards science. Fair enough. My question to you was, if you know anything about the sort of history of disagreements in this area, and like, did any of your findings sort of fall within those patterns and some of those disagreements?
Yeah, they definitely did. Almost like suspiciously so, I would say, which made me like reflect on my coding more, because it was like almost too convenient in terms of the predictive, what we would have guessed they would say was like roughly in the right ballpark. The one thing that was really interesting is that there's a general judging from our previous analyses, the group that we understood scientist one is coming from generally would expect, now let me get this the right way around, essentially one group tends to understand the broader ED research area as being very well established, and they say that we know a lot so we can act now, whereas the other group has this starting point, we actually don't know much, there's loads and loads that we don't know, and this is something that we should take into account when making decisions. And although I forget presently, that was the other way around. So I expected one scientist to say we know loads, like let's go for it, and they actually said we don't know much at all and it's pretty scary, and then the reverse response from the other scientists. So there was definitely components that at least I didn't see coming at all. But to answer your question, they do fit into the kinds of work that Agesta have been doing and that other labs have been doing. and with some exceptions, like I just mentioned, they seem to kind of speak to the classical talking points that their groups tend to bring up in the kind of, the questions that I asked.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Jack? If not, we'll move to the questions for Alexa. We have one from Mauricio. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that some hazards are mostly addressed at the local level, while others, like earthquakes, are more dependent on provincial actions. Given your research results, how do you think a multi-hazard approach might look like? A shared responsibility or framework? Transfer more responsibilities to communities or the province? Thanks.
Sorry, I'm turning on the camera. There you go. Yeah, thanks, Mauricio. I think that, I think there needs to be, and this relates to a question that Ryan asks down below. There's been a lot of success in very select communities that have kind of like a regional approach. So in Vancouver region, it's IPREM, so the Integrated Emergency Management Partnership. And it's been quite successful at combining the local and the regional. It's kind of not provincial, not super local, and they have a bit more leeway of covering different hazards. And so they have worked on transportation for earthquakes. They have worked on transportation, I think, of water, I believe, but it's very select. I think only Vancouver region and Victoria region have one. So I think if that expanded more to like the north, more interior, I think that would be an approach that could be taken. Yeah, and I see Daniel has a question, I think, for Jack.
I would guess maybe it's a question for Jack. Daniel.
Yeah, it is a question for Jack. So I was just going to ask a question related to, excuse me, I'm gonna close my door. About the last slide about the alcohol and its, talk over beers and this kind of thing. And so here's another possible interpretation of what's going on there, and I'll just see what you think about it. So one way to read it is it's a kind of conflict avoidance, right? And because people don't usually find direct confrontations and conflict unpleasant, and so we can talk about it over beers as a way to sort of to suggest it's not something we need to fight about. So I don't know, that's just a thought.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. And I think one thing that would lend itself to that interpretation is, this is from memory now, but I think 3 of the 4 times the image came up was in those interactive moments rather than in the moments when I was just asking them questions directly. So if it was a conflict avoiding thing, I suppose it could make more sense for them to bring it up in situations where they were kind of face to face with the opposing part, well, not opposing, the other participant. So yeah, very possibly. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you. I'll take another question from the chat, and then we'll go to Ramsey. To Alexa, historically, some communities have been reluctant to partner into regional planning groups to address shared hazards such as flooding, wildfire, tsunamis. Do you think there are lessons to be learned from our experiences over the past few fire seasons and COVID that might encourage more regional planning and response?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the wildfire, definitely opened eyes of needing to be collaborative. No one community has all the resources that would be self-sufficient, specifically the smaller communities. COVID, it was quite ad hoc, but they created their own, I guess, WhatsApp group to communicate amongst themselves, the emergency managers. My concern is that this is all quite ad hoc and just because they have really good, passionate people, and it's not necessarily because it's within the actual program itself. So that would be pretty concerning for sustained change, particularly when I look back at the LinkedIn profiles of people where they're working now a year later, and a lot of them have left. So that's something to follow up with because a lot of them have left their jobs and gone elsewhere.
Thank you. Ramsey, did you change your mind? Do you want to ask a question? I guess Ramsey changed their mind. We are almost at time. So thank you for 2 great presentations and good questions, nice discussions. And see you next week again, everybody. A big applause for the two presentations.